Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Midtina Bliss. I am the Communications and Programs Director for Honesty for Ohio Education. Our agenda tonight, I'm just going to do a quick, brief introduction of Honesty, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker, Diana Rhodes, and then Diana is going to do a presentation on countering the parents' rights narrative, and we will end today with a Q&A. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to send those in the chat or submit them through the Q&A. We will hold them until the Q&A, but if they just come up and about, we'll make sure that we get to those during the question and answer section. Honesty for Ohio Education is a statewide, nonpartisan organization and coalition that champions honest education, affirmation of identities and cultures, and local control in education. Honesty's mission is to convene, educate, and activate individuals and communities to protect honest and inclusive education and to build a more representative democracy for every Ohioan. Our coalition is nonpartisan and statewide. We have over 70 partners across the state of Ohio, and there are 3 pillars that Honesty focuses on, which is education, advocacy, and community building. Our priorities center around what's going on in the State House, the State Board of Education, and then also local schools. We are also a hub for education-related news, information about what's going on in the State House, State Board of Education, and around in local schools across Ohio. We also feature events for all of our 70 partner organizations. So there's lots of different events that you can find on our website. And then we have different programs like this, our Lunch and Learn, and different types of educational programming and advocacy that we do throughout the year. And we also have an organizing wing called Honesty Teams. Honesty believes that every child deserves an honest and high-quality education, regardless of their background or the zip code that they live in. We believe that education must reflect and celebrate all students' identities. We believe dismissing racism and discrimination is extremely harmful for individuals and communities. We believe that students benefit most when caring families, educators, and school boards work together for our students. And we also believe that honesty in education is the freedom of critical thinking and is necessary for a high-functioning multiracial democracy. I'm going to jump into introducing our speaker, Diana Rhodes. Diana is the Vice President of Policy, Partnerships, and Organizing at Advocates for Youth. Advocates for Youth is a national sexual and reproductive health and rights organization that centers the needs and voices of young people, while building young people's power to mobilize for change in their communities. In her role, Diana oversees the organization's policy, advocacy strategies, and youth organizing campaigns on a wide range of reproductive and sexual health, rights, and justice issues that affect young people. She's a member of Advocates Management Team and leads strategic partnerships and movement building efforts. Her expertise and work centers around working with national and state coalition advocates across the field and youth activists on policy, advocacy strategy, grassroots campaigns, movement building, and youth adult partnerships. She currently sits as a co-chair of the Federal Sex Ed Coalition, serves on the advisory committee for the COMS Project, and is a member of the Federal Family Planning Steering Committee. If folks in this group would like to introduce themselves in the chat, just please send your name and your pronouns and the area of Ohio that you are from. I'm going to hand it over to you, Diana.
Great, thank you for that intro. Also, I love hearing a deeper dive on the work that Honesty and this coalition does. So appreciate it and appreciate you all having me. And yeah, let's get started. Again, my name is Diana Rhodes. I use she, her pronouns. And we're going to be talking today a little bit about some messaging research that Advocates for Youth and our partners completed recently, and specifically around messaging and messaging to counter the quote-unquote parents' rights narrative. So we can move forward. Great. So a little background about this research. We're going to be talking about, I'm going to go through kind of how we got here, why this research project, a little bit about methodology, and then some kind of takeaways, trends, and also key messages, tested messages that we worked with in this. So again, this is a little bit about that research. Now, the kind of purpose behind this project was really to inform communications efforts to educate, persuade, and mobilize people against harmful parents' rights attacks. These attacks have become synonymous with some of the far right's most dangerous legislation in the last few years. So when we say, or when I speak about, parents' rights attacks, and you might hear me say, talk about restrictions and bans, we're talking about the full gamut of some of the restrictions, bans, and policies that the parents' rights movement has pushed over the last few years, like book banning, educational censorship, attacks on sex education, attacks on trans young people, um, uh, including policies in schools, engaging in sports, attacks on youth access to abortion or contraception. So the gamut from kind of educational censorship to what we see in like reproductive and LGBTQ spaces. We know right now that that schools are the quote unquote our schools are now like the center point of the quote unquote cultural wars as part of a kind of cultural narrative that rhetoric that we're seeing. And so what we wanted to do was really provide do some research and provide some messaging that might be able to support many of our colleagues and advocates across the field who are maybe working on these different particular issues on how to connect those dots. And if those dots should be connected at all, from book banning to trans rights, right? What we were seeing and what I was seeing across the various movements that advocates participates in is that the LGBTQ groups were fighting against the trans youth attacks or the anti-LGBTQ efforts, and the repro groups working on repro issues, the education folks working on education issues, but not necessarily connecting the dots or actually kind of and using talking points that we really just pushing against and trying to redefine parents' rights in that rhetoric. And so this research was to explore a little bit further from that to see if we could get some messages that we could test and some messaging frameworks that might be supportive cross movement. So this project was led by Advocates for Youth in partnership with our friends over at Red, Wine, and Blue. Done some great work in Ohio. And we worked with Perry Undum and the Center for Advancing Innovative Policy with Kate to lead these research efforts. Our amazing team is below. Into the next slide. So a little bit about methodology. So we did both qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative, we did a qual board, we did 2 focus groups, and then from there, we were able to take insights. We took a lot from those focus groups and those conversations and really helped inform a national survey that was out in the field late last year. We had over 2,000 adults fill out the survey and engage with this national survey. You can see the breakdown of demographics here. But about half of the people that we surveyed were parents of K-12 children. The qualitative research was fully parents of K-12 children. Slide. So what does the data suggest? A few different pieces here. So what we did find was that the majority of the public is vulnerable to the quote unquote parents' rights narrative. We found that the parents' rights narrative does have narrative power, but we also found that many have not yet heard a lot about the topic. So that means there's more space for a narrative to unfold and take hold. And that can be on any side, right? So a majority of parents, and when I say vulnerable, when I say publicly vulnerable to the parents' rights narrative, we mean that especially in focus groups, when we share kind of the initial, and also in the quantitative, when we share the initial kind of talking points, right? The kind of way the parents' rights movement uses innocuous language to really kind of co-opt people into their framework. When we share those talking points, many people were like, oh, okay, right? Found it innocuous enough, right? And then as they continued, that tends to change. So when we say the public is vulnerable to it, meaning many people are empathetic and are willing to listen further with some of that narrative. So what that means is that we know that this narrative is working. We know that also because of the policies and practices we're seeing. We also know it because of the misinformation and the campaigns we're seeing in our own communities across the country. But we also know that the public hasn't heard a ton about it, right? So there's still room and there's still space for a narrative to unfold and take hold, whether it be kind of our movements or the parents' rights movement. So a little bit about the audience analysis. I'm going to walk through a little bit about kind of our quantitative research here, and what we found as far as the audiences that we talked to understand where the general public was on parents' rights, on issues related to parents' rights. Our analysis was based on clustered attitude with varying levels of views and interest in the topic. What we found is the audiences, when it comes to understanding and taking in and their views around issues related to parents' rights, it didn't fall into our normal categorizations. Roughly a third of the participants were in our base, a third were in the middle, and a third in our opposition. And we found that not every audience could be persuaded to take action, regardless of viewpoint. Again, we were looking for messages that would be able to mobilize our audiences to take action. We wanted to be able to mobilize people who could take action to take action. And so that's really what we're focusing on. We also found that no racial and ethnic group was a monolith on the issue. There were respondents across race and ethnicity in every single audience. And that includes women. Women, including moderate women, fell into every single segment. So when our researchers tend to see certain categorizations, whether it's on demographic, whether it's on identity, whether it's on a region, when it comes to viewpoints, or public polling or opinions. We found in this research that they didn't fall into any normal categorizations. Next slide. So here's a little bit of the kind of audiences that we found when it comes to these issues. Again, you'll see that a third are in base, third in that kind of muddled middle, and a third in our opposition. You'll also see that there were categories of people who were just not interested in taking action, even if they were in our base, right? This aligned and movable. So there's a whole section of people who were there with us, values-wise, not much could really mobilize them to take action. Same with our moderates, right? So we really were focusing on what we call our primed and ready and our persuadable activists in the middle. You can move to yeah. So our opportunities, back one more. Yep. Our opportunities are primarily with two audiences that are likely to engage. And again, this is what we were focusing on in this research. Our primed and ready is our core base who's ready to act. These are folks who need minimal info, but definitely need a reminder of what's at stake, and they need direction. Most are also not parents. And it's also, I think, something important to kind of think about. The persuadable activist was a kind of key demographic that we found and that we were surprised about. There was a segment in the middle who were vulnerable to the parents' rights frame that actually opposed the policies beneath it. Again, when we talked earlier about what the data suggested as far as the public being vulnerable, but there's still space for a narrative to take hold. This is that kind of core group we were talking about in that middle. They are vulnerable to the parents' rights frame, but actually oppose the policies that undergird it. So their support for the parents' rights movement issues or the parents' rights movement stops where policies begin. It's really important. They also need education and direction, and they tend to have more liberal parenting styles, maybe more liberal views on race, but maybe are more conservative on sexuality and gender. These were some of the takeaways we were finding about this particular audience. So really, when I'm talking about the rest of this presentation about our audiences, these are the audiences that we were really focusing on as we move forward in the research. Now we can go to the next one. So just kind of where we're starting, and then we're going to move more into the meat of things, that we know that most Americans haven't yet heard a lot about the topic known as parents' rights. We know that there's still space for extremists to make their case, and we know that the public can be vulnerable to it. But we also know that it also means that there's a lot of room for us to get there first with compassion, facts, using frames that resonate, educate, and inspire to take action. And that's what this research is about, and hopefully helpful for some of the work that you all do in your communities. I'm going to walk through a bit some top themes that we found in both the qualitative and quantitative research, and some messages that also resonated and tested well. Next slide, please. Great. So one of the first themes that we found was on framing. On frames, we found that our audiences are more centered on young people, so their own kids, children in their lives, young people writ large, than themselves as parents. People are most worried about children's well-being and safety, We found that bullying was the #1 issue for parents and getting a well-rounded education. Our audiences are more concerned about how these policies will affect their children and less able to articulate the impact on society and on parents. They're less likely to view the policy through a parent's lens. Again, this is our oppositions frame. And I think this was really important that when we were in these focus groups, we found that, we would talk about the book banning policies and all of these different policies that we were seeing using a parents' rights frame. And so many of what we heard, a lot of feedback was the inability or to articulate what is the impact on themselves as parents. What they cared most about was the impact on young people or other kids. What's going to happen if these laws pass? What would the impact be on their kids? That's where they wanted to know, and that's actually what motivated them to act. They don't necessarily view these policies through something's being taken away from me as a parent. That lens, that's our oppositions frame. So again, trying to not replicate our oppositions frame and use a frame that centers our values, but also where our audiences are most centered on. So really focusing on young people and the impact on young people. Next slide, please. So what we found is some of the most concerning impacts on young people that we kind of listed out. You want to focus on the freedoms and opportunities youth and their own kids will lose when these far right policies may be enacted. So loss of knowledge of history, loss of access to high quality, well-rounded education, loss of access to books, loss of freedom to learn about the world and all who are in it, loss of access to different perspectives and views, facing more bullying, facing more mental health issues, a loss of sense of safety and protection at school. Again, parents were most concerned around bullying. They're most concerned about safety and a well-rounded education. So these were kind of the most concerning impacts on young people that we heard. So you really want to focus on what are the opportunities and freedoms and rights that kids will lose out on if these policies were passed. Next slide, please. So some messages that really resonated. Kids are losing basic rights like safety and access to knowledge about themselves, their bodies, their history, the world. Teaching empathy is one way our schools are working to reduce bullying. Let's make sure kids get the information they need to understand the world, the people in it, and be successful in life. It could be uncomfortable to learn about dark aspects of our past, but kids must learn accurate history so they don't repeat it. School should be a place where kids are safe, inspired, supported, and treated with dignity. Really focusing in on the impact on young people and what's happening in schools, and also reminding people what's most important as far as schools and what school should be a place for, where young people are safe, they're inspired, supported, etc. Next slide, please. Another big thing we saw was around these collective bans. We found it was really important to actually spell out what was happening. We found that the overwhelming number and types of bans really drives home the point. So we're seeing so many different restrictions across the country, state, local level, school board level, bans on lessons that teach empathy, banning schools protecting LGBTQ kids, requiring bodily inspection or period tracking for girls, bans on sex ed, book banning on books that deal with race, sex, or queer issues, other bans and censorship about what teachers can talk about in classes. The volume of bans helps drive home that this was a political strategy. So we want to not be afraid to list them out or put them in a visual graphic. One of my colleagues who helped me on this project from that works closely with advocates in Red, Wine, and Blue, she's a communication strategist. And she would always say things like, less is more. You don't want to bog people down with a bunch of too many words or listing things out, talking about too many like wonky policies. And what we found in this research was actually quite the opposite, because there is an education gap of people around the country when it comes to not only these issues that we're seeing in schools, but also parents' rights movement. It was actually more important to spell out what was happening and talk about the overwhelming number of types of bans and restrictions we're seeing across the country, not just talking about one issue or one piece of the puzzle. Because what happens then, it really drives home this fact that we're trying to get to, that this is a political strategy. The collective set of policies fills the awareness gaps and evokes a strong emotion that can spark a desire to act. Again, what we're trying to do is move audiences to take action. Next slide, please. And once we get through kind of the collective bans and really kind of showing what is actually happening in this country, what our audiences then move to, and once their audiences understand the sheer number of bans, they begin to see these policies as disingenuous, questioning the political motivation behind them. And that's where we want to get our audiences and our messaging. The connective tissue across all these bans is control. Our audiences think bans are about control over people, control rooted in religion, or about white supremacy, control over others. And the second to control is political power. The more you connect specific bands to each other or to other issues they care about, the more willing people were to take action. These are some quotes that we heard from people in these focus groups about how extreme politicians are trying to pass these laws because they want to control people, they want to divide people, they want to impose their beliefs on everyone. So really this kind of, having our audiences understand, connecting the dots about all of these different policies, bans, and restrictions really does help our audiences start to question the political motivation. And once they're able to connect those dots, they're more willing to do something about it. Again, there's an education gap, right? We heard even from our own in the focus groups. I recall someone's, being nervous to take action, like going to a school board meeting about an anti-trans policy in their school board because they felt like they didn't know, they weren't experts. Their kid wasn't trans. They didn't know any trans kids. They thought they understood a little bit, but they felt because they had a gap in their own education, they weren't, they didn't have the expertise to speak out as a concerned citizen, right? But when we kind of walked through different messages and they started to kind of see that this one anti-trans policy is one thing, but there's actually happening in school and communities across the country and are connected to book banning, are connected to other bans and restrictions, not just this one ban. That's when they started to kind of move through what the processes we've just been talking about, and they were more willing to go. They're like, actually, I don't need to know everything I need there is to know about trans youth because these people don't actually care about trans people. They don't care about really what's going on. This is about power and control. And that actually motivated them more so to take action. That helped with the education gap and helped connect the dots for them. Next slide. So some kind of top line messages. And these numbers might be wrong. We tested these messages, a few months back, so we can update those if we were to use this as far as the actual number of book bans. But since 2020, there have been over 1,700 book bans in the country. Hundreds of new laws are censoring what teachers can talk about, banning sex ed, stopping teachers from teaching things like empathy, requiring period tracking, bodily inspection, and putting LGBTQ kids in danger. The folks pushing this agenda call it parents' rights. It's a political strategy funded by a far-right activist at the national level to gain power, divide, and control people. A child's hormonal makeup or healthcare is not our business. This is between parents, their child, and their doctor. All young people, including trans and non-binary students, deserve a safe environment where they can be themselves in peace. We did test specific trans messages, and I'll go into that later. So really kind of painting a picture about what's happening across the country. So if you're doing kind of local advocacy efforts, really connecting what's going on here with what's going on across the country, it really does help put into perspective what's happening in our own communities. Next slide, please. Another kind of theme that we saw was really kind of needing to meet parents where they're at. And, we know that our opposition, weaponizes fear, right? We know that the parents' rights movement very much uses this strategy. And so what we found is it was really important to actually meet parents where they're at and acknowledge that this is a scary and hard time, but move into a place of collective hope and empowerment rather than fear, rather than a fear-based message, which is what we see opposition do. So for example, it's a hard and scary time to be a parent. Society and technology are changing fast. We want to keep our kids safe and protect them. The answer is not bans. censorship, or things that create an unsafe environment for everyone. Let's provide students with accurate age-appropriate sex ed while continuing to allow parents to opt out their kids if they choose. Let's reject politicians who are riling people up and turning us against each other for their own political power. Let's get informed and support each other and our kids. So really kind of meeting parents where they're at, recognizing that it is a scary issue. What we found in all of our audiences that this isn't a scary issue. All of these issues are very scary, regardless of where you land on kind of your beliefs and values on it. So really acknowledging that and being very real about it. I mean, I think it's a hard and scary time to be a parent. It's also a hard and scary time just to be a human right now in this country. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. But then coming together with a collective sense of hope and empowerment and reminding people, and especially if you are talking to parents, to not only be thinking about their kids, but really what all young people need, right? We want to get informed, and we want to support each other and our kids. We want to support each other. And we want to do this together. Next slide, please. So specifically on trans issues, we did a little bit of a deeper dive on trans youth because of some of the trend that we're seeing in the last number of years about on trans attacks or attacks on trans young people. And we found around specifically about trans youth issues that there is still a large education gap. But we also found that the themes that we were just talking about, the collective bans, power and control, and youth focus, are still through lines to issues that specifically impact trans youth. So the emphasis on a safe environment and concern over bullying continues to resonate when applied to trans youth. The two main questions that our audience had about trans young people were how and when did they know, and how can we support them? Regardless of where, especially in our focus groups, where the parents and participants in these focus groups landed, whether they were in more support or understood, or where they were politically on LGBTQ or trans issues. These were the main questions folks had, which I think is also something that's really important to recognize, is that folks still have a lot of questions, but they want to know how to support trans youth. They want to know how to support young people. So especially on trans youth issues, educating our audiences, we can consider answering some of these questions and using kind of culture shift strategies like storytelling or other kind of strategies. But remembering that these kind of themes of collective bans, power control, youth focus, and emphasis on safety really were through lines even on trans youth issues, and even with people who were not quite there with us on politically or on their kind of viewpoints on trans youth issues. Next slide. So again, just kind of going a little bit deeper, the volume of bans is overwhelming, right? And so that same theme around collective bans really was a through line on trans youth. And so these are just some of the bans and restrictions we're seeing across the country on trans people, adults and children. So kind of literally listing them out, really situating what's happening in their community with what we're seeing across the country, both at a federal, state, and local level. And it's not just trans youth, it's trans adults as well. And so really kind of contextualizing and showing and having people understand the sheer volume of bans that we've been seeing across the country helps connect those dots. Next slide, please. So some messages talking about trans issues. In the past 5 months alone, 82 laws have passed across states to ban and restrict trans people and children. There are 27 federal bans and restrictions under consideration just right now. Some politicians and a few outspoken parents are focused on these. But just like other parents, the parents of trans kids want their kids to learn and grow and play sports if they want to. These politicians have no idea what parents of trans children go through to understand how to support their children. Again, meeting parents where they're at about what their shared values are as parents, and the collective bans, and kind of moving that into illuminating power and control and connecting the dots on on the policies and bans and restrictions we're seeing on trans people generally. Next slide. Here's some top line messages on trans girls in sports. We did test some of these as well. Every child's body and athletic potential is different. We've all known girls in school who are taller and stronger than many boys their age. We don't keep them from playing sports alongside shorter or less strong girls. Some boys are shorter and smaller than many girls. We don't ban the stronger and bigger boys from sports to make it fair for smaller boys. There's no scientific evidence that the average trans girl athlete is any bigger, stronger, or faster than any other girls. The point of school sports is to have opportunities to grow, learn, make friends, be healthy, and have fun. Sports are a part of education, and no child should be banned from that. This is a time when we're seeing a lot of those bans on, and many have been enacted, on trans youth or specifically trans girls participating in sports. The last talking point was really kind of taking in what we've heard in focus groups from so many different people about why sports, you know, like what's the important, why would you want your child to be play sports in school? Like, why do you think sports are important? And really going back to like the collective sense of responsibility and collective sense of like pulling back and reminding folks about what's most important, right? About schools, about engaging in sports, etc. It's to have opportunities to grow, learn, make friends, be healthy, have fun. Schools are places to learn, meet new people, and also to feel safe, right? Reminding folks what's most important, values that are most important in these spaces. Next slide, please. So this slide really was around kind of a pre-narrative and post-narrative change with the various audiences that we talked about in the very beginning of this presentation. And what we found here, if you see in the change category of our audiences that we're focusing on, primed and ready and persuadable activists, in the pre and post narrative, there was a considerable amount of change, meaning willingness to take action. And so that's why we're really focusing on these audiences. What's really kind of impressive is that these messages, again, so these messages is what the pre and post narrative, right? These are the messages that we were sharing with people during in the national survey and their quantitative research. But what we also found, what our researchers pointed out, was that our messages also didn't motivate our opposition to take more action either. So, you know, these messages motivated the audiences we want to take action to take action. There's some audiences who will probably never take action. But then our opposition, it didn't necessarily motivate them to take more action than they already were, or it doesn't motivate them to take action, which is like a sweet spot to be, and often we don't necessarily see all the time. So it was good for our audiences and completely neutral for our opposition. So that's also something to note, depending on communities that you're working with. Next slide, please. So we'll just move through these very quickly. I just want to be mindful of time, but just again, focusing or uplifting kind of the main takeaways from this research. Number one, focusing on the impact on young people, right? So you want your narratives and messages to focus on the impact on young people. Our audiences are most concerned about how these policies will affect their children or children writ large. They're less likely to view the policies through a parent's lens. This is our opposition's frame. So it doesn't necessarily do us any services to repeat or recontextualize our opposition's frame. We want to focus more on the impact on young people, and especially focusing on the most concerning impacts that people had as far as what they were most concerned about, and connecting our issues to whichever folks are most concerned about. Next slide. The next takeaway is talking about the collective bans, right? The collective sets of policies fills awareness gaps and evokes strong emotions that spark desires to act. The volume of bans helps drive home this political strategy about controlling people, and you don't want to be afraid to list them out. So, second takeaway, collective bans. Next slide. And then next takeaway is talking about control and power. Once our audiences understand the sheer number of bans, they begin to see these policies as disingenuous. They question the political motivation behind them. And that's the place we want to get them to, understanding that so many of the bans, restrictions, and policies that the parents' rights movement have been pushing across the country is disingenuous. Do they really care about protecting people? Next slide. And then again, meeting parents where they're at. You want to convey hope and empowerment in communications. This issue is very scary, regardless where you land and where your values are. Fear sparks a desire to take action, but it can also be quickly paralyzing. So meeting parents where they're at and then moving them to a framing of hope and empowerment. We know that fear, we know our opposition weaponizes fear in their rhetoric and in their narratives. We know that fear can help, spark desires to take action, but we also know it can be paralyzing. We heard this a lot from the parents that we talked to in our focus groups too, that they were also overwhelmed and they were a bit paralyzed. And so again, we want to give people direction. We want to convey hope and empowerment in our communications and give them a direction as far as taking action. Next slide. So the best narratives, taking everything that we talked about and the messages that we walked through, as far as kind of if you were working on a campaign, if you're thinking about your own messaging, a few different pieces, right? Describing the problem and raising awareness. We know that there's an education gap with the public. Centering some of the most concerning anti-policies, describing the underlying motivation, again, meeting parents where they're at, framing the impact on young people, highlighting safety. This is where our audiences care most about. This is what parents care most about, safety, safety and bullying, and emphasizing a positive call to action. Yeah, so these are all the different pieces that we found make up the best narrative. I also have a resource that I can share with Martina and Christina and make sure that you all have to share that. That includes some of these top line messages, some of these takeaways, and some of these narratives in a simple form. So I can make sure to send this after this webinar and make sure you all have that. Yeah, I think I'm going to end there. I think the next slide is really just my contact information. My inbox is open. I really appreciate the time you all took to listen and hear about some of this research, and hopefully it would be helpful in your own advocacy efforts. But I will end it there.
Awesome. We can move into the Q&A. And just if anyone has questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and I will bring those to Diana. So we have one in the chat from Christina. Do you think some of these messaging techniques work when discussing the dangers of Project 2025, specifically in education, like examples around like bans in education, control and power, et cetera?
Definitely. So when we were doing this research, it was before Project 2025 was out on the scene, but I think it actually is 100% kind of almost gives it to us, right? Because they're telling us this is, it's those messages are in there as far as what they want to do to public education and any almost every topic, right? So I definitely think that if you are talking about Project 2025 in any way, we're a 501c3, so we're more issue-based, but however you are, I think linking, but I think specifically around control and power, like linking those linking those issues and linking your issues to that is definitely, I think goes in line, and Project 2025 just hands it all straight forward to all of us. But I definitely think, especially with, Project 2025 and what we've been seeing already, the election season, I think, the kind of piece around meeting parents where they're at is kind of really key right now. I think it's a really scary time. I think it's a scarier time like right now than it was a month ago and a month before that, right? Like it just continues to be challenging, right? And this is not only just policies, but even like AI for parents, right? Like, and some of those policies and what's going on in classrooms. So really kind of meeting parents where they're at in that sense and acknowledging that, and also with Project 2025, I think our audiences are quite scared of it. And I think it is a scary document and it's dangerous, right? And so really also trying to that kind of piece around conveying hope and empowerment and a direction if you are trying to get folks to take action, like finding a way to not just sit in the fear place and where the hope and empowerment place comes in. Because I think this just generally that's where so many of our audiences are at right now. I think that's a really important place to be.
Thank you. I have a question. So I know you talked about like the primed and ready demographic isn't necessarily or really parents. Was there like something specific about that demographic, like an age group, or was it kind of just super broad, like just a lot of different people maybe like leaning one way on like the political scale or something?
Um, yeah, I mean, the biggest piece, the biggest part of that audience was really that they were completely values aligned. They were right there when it came to analysis around gender and sexuality or policies related to gender and sexuality. Um, we found that many of them did not have kids. They also that audience actually skewed older, that which was a little bit surprising. And I think you know they were probably the ones who were most politically engaged or willing to take action. Um, we our kind of like willingness to take action doesn't necessarily always go from our own kind of like political leanings and sometimes like our time and energy. So when we also looked at like the aligned and the people who were immovable, but they were aligned, um, many of them were parents as well. Some of them were parents, but they were parents of like younger kids. And that's just time, right? Like they're like, yeah, I go to school board meetings. I don't right now. I've got other things I need to deal with, right? So I think that was also another piece of like, people's willingness to go out to a school board meeting or email a representative, et cetera. Um, and so I think also, yeah, so I think that was the case. It was way less, it was way more, all the audiences were much more broad demographic wise than we had, that I was assuming going into it, that it was much broader age and gender and demographic wise, but it wasn't actually in these kind of normal categorizations.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Um, and then I have another question. So, like, when talking about like sex education and things like that, so like Ohio doesn't have health standards, so it's not like required to teach anything like that in Ohio. Is that something that like audiences generally found very important and were like alarmed by like bans in sex education and things like that in schools?
Um, what is your question? Like, were audiences alarmed by like specifically around
Yeah,
sex?
like was that like a moving, because like of course bans as a whole is like something
Yeah.
that was persuasive to audiences and something that people really cared about. Was that something particularly that some of the audiences were very concerned about, is like trying to ban or take away like sex education in school?
I would say, as someone who also works on sex ed a lot more, and this is an area I feel like, especially the state level, I've done quite a bit of work in. So connected to this research and generally in other public opinion research that's out there, people just don't know what's being taught in schools. Like they don't know, like they are, they're concerned about banning sex ed. But if you were to ask them what they think sex ed is, it's not. And so that's what I'm saying, regardless of like what's actually happening in Ohio. But if you were to ask folks like what actually sex ed is or what's being taught in their schools, oftentimes what is true and what is actually happening and what folks think is completely out of, completely different. So
Yeah.
we do find that like the concern um, around sex ed bans, or at least anything around sex education, people do have strong feelings about. Um, and I think in Ohio, actually, there's probably something. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
like
in
Ohio
Ohio,
has,
I didn't realize it's
yeah,
illegal to teach, like have standards for health, which is wild. And like, I guess we're the only state with that
doesn't
that made
have
it illegal.
That's interesting, but there's still curricula being taught. So while there's like standard, like depending on what school district, right? Like,
Yes.
so I think
Hmm.
Ohio, from what I remember, is much more district by district than at the state level because it is probably much more kind of ambiguous and broad around the sex education law. Um, so it depends. I think it's also meeting your community where you're at. Like, I think probably some counties and some parents in some counties might care more than other parents in other counties, right? And you all know what's best. Like, you all know your communities most.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I think that's everything. Thank you so much, Diana. I'm gonna just like share some like a couple like links and resources for honesty, but we really appreciate you for coming and for talking with us. And this was really, really excellent and super informative.
Thanks so much. And I can share that resource after this webinar to make sure that you all have it and can share with the coalition.
Awesome. Thank you, Diana. Okay, so just really quickly, I just wanted to like plug some different ways that you can get involved with Honesty. So you can join our mailing list. We send out a newsletter every week with events that are going on, local news that's happening. We share legislative updates. Luckily, we won't have a ton of those for the next few months because the legislature is on summer recess until supposedly November. You can also follow us on all social media accounts that we have the same handle across all accounts. You can find I'm going to send a link to our link tree in the chat in just a second. It has all these links on there, so you can find everything from there. But yes, events and programs will be on there. We do a lot of different things throughout the year and also share other partners in the events and programs that they're offering. We also send out action alerts and things like that. So if you're signed up for our mailing list and there's some nasty legislation going across Ohio, and we need people to sign petitions, send emails, make phone calls, we will send out action alerts. And the same goes for when there's great legislation that we really want to promote and support and let our lawmakers know that we really want this in our schools and in our state. And then, yeah, you can join an Honesty team. So that is our organizing wing of Honesty. So there's kind of local teams across Ohio. It is a newer program. It's building and growing. It's a really great way to get involved at the grassroots level. And you can also join our coalition. Here's some QR codes. I'll leave it on here for like just a second. And then lastly, we just have some resources here. So you can, I think you guys can click these. They should be clickable. So really, these are all the links that you would need. But again, I'll send that in the chat. But yeah, thank you. I just want to thank everyone so much for joining today and for being here amongst all the craziness that happened over the weekend. And the VP pick today has been a very busy day. But thank you for spending your Monday night with us. And just sent the link tree link in the chat. And I will give you the next 8 minutes before 8 o'clock back to you all for your Monday evening.